196 years after the last recorded entry, a leather-bound ledger emerged from the basement of a demolished courthouse in Charleston County, South Carolina. The water-damaged pages contained meticulous records that would shatter everything historians thought they knew about the Whitmore plantation. Before we continue, subscribe and ring the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a genealogist researching family histories for the Charleston Heritage Project, discovered the ledger in March 2023. What she initially believed to be routine plantation records quickly revealed themselves as documentation of something far more sinister. The entries, written in elegant script, detailed marriages, births, and deaths with clinical precision. But these weren't ordinary plantation records. The ledger belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, mistress of Rosewood Plantation, and documented her systematic program of forced marriages between her own sons and enslaved women. Each entry recorded not just names and dates, but detailed observations about bloodlines, physical characteristics, and what she called breeding potential. The first entry, dated April 15, 1829, reads, "Thomas, my eldest, has completed his union with the girl Celia. She shows promising traits for the continuation of our line. The arrangement proceeds as planned." Mrs. Mitchell's hands trembled as she read entry after entry, each one more disturbing than the last. Here was evidence of a woman who had turned her own plantation into a breeding ground, using her sons as unwilling participants in a program designed to create what she termed superior offspring. The Whitmore plantation, located in the Low Country region of South Carolina, had been considered one of the most successful rice plantations in the state. Eleanor Whitmore was known in Charleston society as a devout Christian woman, a pillar of the community who hosted elaborate dinner parties and contributed generously to local churches. Her sons were educated gentlemen who married well and maintained the family's social standing, or so the official records claimed. The truth preserved in Eleanor's private ledger painted a dramatically different picture. The woman, celebrated for her moral character, had orchestrated one of the most systematic programs of sexual exploitation in the antebellum South. Her sons, far from being willing participants, were themselves victims of their mother's twisted vision. As Dr. Mitchell continued reading, she discovered that Eleanor had begun planning her program years before its implementation. Earlier entries from 1827 detailed her selection process for enslaved women, noting their health, age, and what she described as desirable characteristics. She had purchased specific women from other plantations, sometimes paying premium prices for those who met her criteria. The program wasn't random or impulsive. It was calculated, methodical, and designed to produce children who would serve specific roles within her plantation system. Some were intended for field work, others for domestic service, and a select few were groomed for what Eleanor termed special duties. The ledger also revealed the resistance she encountered. Her eldest son, Thomas, had initially refused to participate, leading to months of documented manipulation and threats. Eleanor used financial pressure, emotional blackmail, and threats of disinheritance to force compliance. She recorded his eventual submission with satisfaction. "Thomas has seen reason. The first union will proceed as scheduled." But the true horror lay not just in the forced marriages themselves, but in what happened to the children born from these unions. Eleanor maintained detailed records of each birth, tracking physical and mental development with the same precision she applied to her rice crops. Children who didn't meet her standards were sold to distant plantations, separated forever from their parents. The enslaved women involved had no choice in these arrangements. They were property to be used as Eleanor saw fit. Their suffering was documented indirectly through Eleanor's clinical observations, but their voices, their pain, their resistance, their humanity, were reduced to mere footnotes in her systematic record-keeping. Dr. Mitchell realized she had stumbled upon evidence of crimes that had been hidden for nearly 2 centuries. The Whitmore family had maintained their reputation through careful manipulation of public records, destruction of evidence, and the complicity of a society that preferred not to look too closely at the source of plantation wealth. As she photographed each page of the ledger, Dr. Mitchell understood that she held in her hands the key to a story that had been deliberately silenced. The voices of the enslaved women, the coerced sons, and the children born into this nightmare had finally found their way to the surface. The discovery would soon spark an investigation that would challenge everything the community thought it knew about its past and force a reckoning with truths that had been buried for far too long. Eleanor Catherine Whitmore wasn't born into cruelty. She cultivated it with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else in her privileged life. Born Eleanor Blackwood in 1795 to a prominent Charleston banking family, she had been raised with the expectations and entitlements of Southern aristocracy. Her marriage to plantation owner Robert Whitmore in 1815 seemed like a perfect union of wealth and status. Robert owned 1,500 acres of prime rice-growing land along the Ashley River, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The couple appeared to embody the ideals of Southern gentility: wealthy, well-connected, and devoted to maintaining the social order that sustained their prosperity. But Eleanor harbored ambitions that extended far beyond the typical role of plantation mistress. Her private correspondence, discovered alongside the breeding ledger, reveals a woman obsessed with what she called bloodline improvement and genetic superiority. These letters, written to her sister Margaret in Savannah, provide chilling insight into the mind that would conceive and implement the Rosewood breeding program. In an 1826 letter, Eleanor wrote, "I have been studying the breeding practices used for our finest horses and hunting dogs. The principles are sound and could be applied to our people with remarkable results. Robert thinks me too ambitious, but I see possibilities he cannot imagine." Eleanor's studies weren't limited to animal husbandry. She had acquired books on what was then called racial science, pseudoscientific works that attempted to classify human beings like livestock. Her personal library, catalogued after her death, included titles that promoted theories of genetic hierarchy and selective breeding. She annotated these books extensively, treating them as instruction manuals for her planned experiments. The death of her husband Robert in 1827 removed the final obstacle to her plans. Robert had apparently been uncomfortable with his wife's increasingly radical ideas about plantation management. His sudden death from what was recorded as river fever gave Eleanor complete control over Rosewood and its inhabitants. With her husband gone, Eleanor moved quickly to implement her vision. She began by identifying the enslaved women she considered most suitable for her program. Her selection criteria, detailed in the ledger, focused on women between the ages of 16 and 25, who showed what she termed physical perfection and docile temperament. Celia, who would become the first victim of Eleanor's program, was described in the ledger as 19 years of age, excellent health, pleasing features, and appropriate submission to authority. Eleanor had purchased Celia from a neighboring plantation specifically for this purpose, paying nearly twice the normal price. But the most disturbing aspect of Eleanor's program wasn't just the selection of enslaved women, it was the coercion of her own sons. Thomas James and William Whitmore were expected to participate in their mother's breeding scheme as a matter of family duty. Eleanor used every tool of manipulation at her disposal to ensure their compliance. Thomas, the eldest at 24, initially resisted his mother's demands. Letters between Eleanor and her lawyer reveal that she threatened to disinherit him entirely if he refused to cooperate. She also used social pressure, telling him that his refusal would bring shame upon the family name and ruin his prospects for marriage within Charleston society. The psychological manipulation was systematic and cruel. Eleanor convinced her sons that their participation was not just expected, but morally justified. She framed the program as a form of Christian stewardship, claiming that she was improving the lives of enslaved people by creating children with superior characteristics. James, the middle son, appears to have been more susceptible to his mother's influence. His letters show a young man struggling with guilt and confusion, ultimately submitting to what he saw as his family obligation. "Mother speaks of duty and improvement," he wrote to a friend. "I cannot reconcile my feelings with what she demands, but I am bound by blood to obey." William, the youngest at 19, had no choice in the matter. As a minor still dependent on his mother's support, he was simply informed of his role in the program and expected to comply without question. Eleanor's manipulation extended beyond her immediate family. She cultivated relationships with local clergy, judges, and merchants who could help legitimize her activities or look the other way when questions arose. Her charitable donations to churches and community organizations bought her moral cover for activities that would have shocked even the slavery-tolerant society of antebellum South Carolina. She also maintained careful control over information flow on the plantation. Enslaved people who showed signs of rebellion or resistance were quickly sold to distant locations. Those who remained learned to keep silent about what they witnessed, understanding that speaking out would only bring punishment and separation from their families. The breeding program officially began in April 1829 with the forced marriage of Thomas and Celia. Eleanor recorded the event with satisfaction, noting that the first phase of our improvement plan has commenced successfully. She had no way of knowing that her meticulous record-keeping would one day serve as evidence of her crimes. Within 2 years, all 3 of her sons had been forced into marriages with enslaved women. The plantation that had once been known for its productive rice fields became something far more sinister, a laboratory for human experimentation, run by a woman who believed herself to be improving the world through calculated cruelty. The spring of 1829 brought an air of unnatural ceremony to Rosewood Plantation. Eleanor Whitmore had transformed what should have been moments of human connection into calculated transactions designed to serve her twisted vision of genetic improvement. The first forced union between Thomas Whitmore and Celia took place on April 15, 1829, in what Eleanor called a practical arrangement for the betterment of all involved. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was performed by a local minister who had been convinced that he was blessing a legitimate Christian marriage between master and slave. Eleanor's ledger provides chilling details of how she orchestrated these unions. Thomas required significant encouragement to fulfill his obligations, she wrote. I have made clear that his inheritance depends entirely upon his cooperation in this endeavor. Celia has been prepared for her role and understands the expectations placed upon her. The preparation Eleanor mentioned involved weeks of psychological conditioning. Celia had been moved from the quarters to a room in the main house, dressed in clothing befitting her new status, and instructed in her duties as what Eleanor termed a breeding wife. The young woman had no choice but to comply. Resistance would have meant punishment, sale, or worse. Thomas Whitmore, for his part, struggled with the role his mother had forced upon him. Family letters reveal a young man torn between filial duty and moral revulsion. I cannot find peace with what mother demands, he wrote to his cousin in Charleston. Yet she holds my future in her hands, and I see no path forward that does not lead through her will. The second son, James, was paired with a woman named Sarah in August 1829. Sarah had been specifically selected by Eleanor for what the ledger describes as her exceptional physical constitution and breeding potential. Like Celia, Sarah had been purchased from another plantation specifically for Eleanor's program. James appears to have submitted to his mother's demands with less resistance than Thomas, perhaps because he had witnessed his older brother's failed attempts at defiance. Eleanor noted with satisfaction that James shows proper understanding of his responsibilities and the necessity of our work. The third and final forced union occurred in November 1829, when 19-year-old William was paired with Anna, a 16-year-old girl who had been born on the plantation. Eleanor's choice of Anna was particularly calculated. As someone who had grown up at Rosewood, she was completely isolated from any potential support network and entirely dependent on Eleanor's mercy. Eleanor documented each union with clinical detachment, recording physical characteristics, expected breeding schedules, and what she called compatibility assessments. She treated these forced relationships like livestock breeding programs, with no consideration for the human suffering involved. The enslaved women involved in these arrangements faced an impossible situation. They were forced into intimate relationships with men who held ultimate power over their lives, yet those same men were themselves victims of Eleanor's manipulation. The complex dynamics of coercion, resistance, and survival created psychological trauma that would echo through generations. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Celia, the first victim of Eleanor's program, became pregnant within months of her forced marriage to Thomas. Eleanor recorded the pregnancy with the same enthusiasm she might have shown for a successful rice harvest. The first fruits of our labor are evident, she wrote. Celia carries what will be the foundation of our improved line. But pregnancy and childbirth under Eleanor's system meant constant monitoring and evaluation. The enslaved women were subjected to regular examinations, their diets controlled, and their activities restricted to ensure optimal conditions for childbearing. They were treated not as expectant mothers, but as breeding stock. Sarah's pregnancy followed shortly after Celia's, and Eleanor began making comparisons between the two women's conditions. Her notes reveal a disturbing fascination with what she saw as genetic experimentation. Sarah shows superior constitution during pregnancy, she wrote. Her offspring may prove more valuable than Celia's. The forced husbands struggled with their roles in different ways. Thomas attempted to show kindness to Celia within the constraints of their situation, though he could never fully escape the fundamental violation at the heart of their relationship. James maintained emotional distance from Sarah, treating their interactions as a duty to be fulfilled rather than a relationship to be nurtured. William, the youngest, seemed most damaged by his mother's demands. Letters from this period show a young man struggling with depression and guilt. "I am become something I do not recognize," he wrote. "Mother speaks of improvement and progress, but I see only suffering and shame." Eleanor's program extended beyond simple forced marriages. She maintained detailed records of sexual encounters, monitoring frequency and timing to maximize the chances of pregnancy. Her ledger includes charts tracking menstrual cycles and what she called optimal breeding periods. The children born from these unions faced a fate determined entirely by Eleanor's evaluation of their worth. Those who met her standards for physical appearance and perceived intelligence were kept at Rosewood and groomed for specific roles. Those who failed to measure up were sold away, often while still infants. By the end of 1829, Eleanor had successfully implemented the foundation of her breeding program. 3 forced marriages had been established, pregnancies were underway, and the plantation had been reorganized to support her systematic approach to human reproduction. But even as Eleanor celebrated her progress, resistance was building among the enslaved community. Quiet acts of defiance, whispered conversations, and small sabotages signaled that not everyone at Rosewood would submit willingly to her vision of genetic improvement. The forced unions were just the beginning of Eleanor's program. What followed would be years of systematic abuse, family destruction, and psychological manipulation, all documented in her meticulous records and hidden from the outside world by a conspiracy of silence that would last for nearly 2 centuries. The first child born under Eleanor Whitmore's breeding program entered the world on January 12, 1830. Eleanor recorded the birth with clinical precision. Celia delivered a male child at dawn. Physical examination reveals promising characteristics. The child shall be designated as Thomas Jr. and prepared for eventual field supervision roles. What Eleanor saw as the successful beginning of her genetic improvement program, others would recognize as the birth of a child into systematic exploitation. Thomas Jr., like all the children who would follow, was born not into a family, but into a carefully calculated system designed to perpetuate his grandmother's vision of human improvement. Eleanor's approach to child rearing was as methodical as her breeding program. She maintained detailed records of each child's development, tracking physical growth, perceived intelligence, and what she called behavioral tendencies. Children were evaluated and categorized from birth, their futures determined by their performance in Eleanor's assessments. The second child, a daughter born to Sarah and James in March 1830, received different treatment. Eleanor noted that the girl shows exceptional beauty and grace. She will be prepared for domestic service in the main house and possible future breeding potential. This child, whom Eleanor named Grace, would spend her early years being groomed for what her grandmother saw as her predetermined role. By 1831, 5 children had been born under Eleanor's program. Each birth was celebrated not as the arrival of a new family member but as confirmation of the program's success. Eleanor's letters to her sister Margaret reveal her growing confidence in her methods. "The children exceed my expectations. Each generation improves upon the last, validating our scientific approach to human development." But the children born into Eleanor's system faced challenges that went beyond simple enslavement. They existed in a strange liminal space, neither fully enslaved nor free, related to their masters by blood, but denied the privileges of family connection. Their white fathers were simultaneously their owners, creating psychological complexities that would haunt them throughout their lives. Thomas Whitmore struggled most with his role as father to children he could never publicly acknowledge. Letters from this period show him attempting to provide small kindnesses to his sons and daughters, while maintaining the pretense that they were simply valuable plantation property. "I see my own features in young Thomas," he wrote to his cousin, "yet I must treat him as mother demands, denying the bond that nature has created." Eleanor monitored the parent-child relationships carefully. intervening whenever she detected what she called inappropriate attachment. She believed that emotional bonds would interfere with the systematic development she had planned for each child. Fathers were forbidden from showing favoritism, and mothers were reminded that their children belonged to the plantation, not to them. The psychological impact on the enslaved mothers was devastating. They were forced to raise children who could be taken from them at any moment, sold or relocated based solely on Eleanor's evaluation of their worth. Celia, Sarah, and Anna lived in constant fear that their children would fail to meet Eleanor's standards and be separated from them forever. Education for the children followed Eleanor's rigid classification system. Those designated for field work received basic training in agricultural tasks. Children identified for domestic service learned household management and social skills. A select few, whom Eleanor considered candidates for her special breeding program, received more comprehensive education including reading, writing, and arithmetic. Eleanor's evaluation methods became increasingly sophisticated as her program matured. She developed what she called aptitude assessments for children as young as 5, testing their physical coordination, memory, and social skills. Children who scored highly were rewarded with better living conditions and educational opportunities. Those who failed were relegated to field work or sold to other plantations. The record-keeping extended to every aspect of the children's lives. Eleanor maintained files on each child's health, behavior, educational progress, and what she termed breeding potential. She tracked bloodlines with the same precision used by horse breeders, planning future pairings based on genetic characteristics she claimed to observe. By 1835, the second generation of Eleanor's program was beginning to show results. The oldest children were approaching adolescence, and Eleanor began making plans for their future roles in her expanded breeding system. Her letters from this period reveal plans to create what she called breeding pairs from among her most promising children. The complexity of family relationships at Rosewood became increasingly tangled as Eleanor's program continued. Half-siblings raised together without knowledge of their blood relationships, fathers who owned their own children, and grandchildren who were simultaneously property and family, created psychological trauma that would echo through generations. Eleanor's success in hiding the true nature of her program from outside observers was remarkable. Visitors to Rosewood saw what appeared to be a well-managed plantation with healthy, well-cared-for enslaved people. They had no idea that they were witnessing the results of systematic human breeding, guided by one woman's twisted vision of genetic improvement. The children themselves began to understand their unique position as they grew older. They were treated better than typical enslaved people, but could never escape the fundamental reality of their bondage. They wore finer clothes, received better food, and lived in superior quarters, but always with the understanding that these privileges could be revoked at any moment. Some of the children began to show signs of rebellion as they entered adolescence. Eleanor noted these instances with concern, implementing stricter discipline and closer monitoring for children who showed what she called undesirable independence. She understood that maintaining control over her breeding population required constant vigilance and occasional harsh corrections. The success of Eleanor's program, measured by her standards, was undeniable. By 1835, she had created a population of mixed-race children who showed the physical and intellectual characteristics she valued. But this success came at an enormous human cost. Families destroyed, children commodified, and generations condemned to an existence defined entirely by one woman's eugenic fantasies. The children of coercion would carry the psychological scars of Eleanor's program throughout their lives, passing trauma and confusion to their own children in ways that Eleanor never recorded in her meticulous ledgers. The success of Eleanor Whitmore's breeding program depended not just on her control over Rosewood Plantation, but on the complicity of an entire community that chose to look the other way. By 1835, her systematic exploitation had created a network of silence that extended from Charleston's drawing rooms to the local courthouse, protecting her crimes through willful blindness and calculated ignorance. Dr. Hamilton Pierce, the plantation's physician, knew more about Eleanor's program than anyone outside the Whitmore family. His medical records, discovered in 2024 among papers donated to the Charleston Medical Society, revealed detailed knowledge of the forced breeding system. Pierce monitored pregnancies, supervised births, and examined children with the same clinical detachment Eleanor brought to her record-keeping. Pierce's notes show that he understood exactly what was happening at Rosewood. Mrs. Whitmore's approach to population management shows remarkable results, he wrote, in a confidential report to a colleague. The systematic pairing of selected individuals has produced offspring with notably superior physical characteristics. He framed Eleanor's human experimentation as scientific progress, willingly participating in the medicalization of exploitation. The local pastor, Reverend Charles Manning, provided religious justification for Eleanor's activities. Manning had performed the initial ceremonies that Eleanor called marriages, blessing unions he knew were based on coercion rather than consent. His sermons from this period, preserved in church archives, frequently addressed the topic of Christian stewardship and the moral obligation of masters to improve their enslaved populations. Manning's complicity extended beyond simple ceremony. He provided theological cover for Eleanor's program, arguing that her selective breeding was a form of Christian charity that would improve the lives of future generations. Mrs. Whitmore shows the highest form of Christian responsibility, he wrote in a letter to his bishop. Her commitment to the improvement of her people demonstrates godly stewardship of the resources entrusted to her care. The legal system provided another layer of protection for Eleanor's activities. Judge William Crawford, who presided over Charleston County's courts, was a frequent dinner guest at Rosewood and a close friend of the Whitmore family. Crawford's court records show a pattern of dismissing or minimizing any complaints related to plantation management, particularly those involving the treatment of enslaved people. When a neighboring planter raised questions about the unusual number of mixed-race children at Rosewood, Crawford dismissed the inquiry as inappropriate speculation about private family matters. His ruling established a legal precedent that protected Eleanor from official scrutiny, while signaling to other potential critics that such questions would not be tolerated. The Charleston social elite contributed to the conspiracy of silence through their studied indifference to obvious signs of Eleanor's program. Plantation visits revealed populations of mixed-race children who bore unmistakable family resemblances to the Whitmore men. Yet guests maintained the polite fiction that these were simply well-treated enslaved people. Mrs. Catherine Rutledge, a prominent Charleston socialite, wrote extensively about her visits to Rosewood in letters to relatives in Savannah. Her correspondence reveals someone who clearly understood what she was witnessing, but chose to interpret it through the lens of Southern hospitality rather than moral evaluation. Eleanor maintains such a well-ordered household, she wrote. Her people are notably healthy and well cared for, though I confess some of the children bear striking resemblances to their masters. The economic benefits of Eleanor's program provided additional motivation for silence. Rosewood's productivity increased significantly during the 1830s, generating profits that benefited not just the Whitmore family, but the entire regional economy. Local merchants, suppliers, and traders all profited from the plantation's success, creating financial incentives to ignore the source of that prosperity. Bank records from the Charleston Commercial Bank show that Eleanor's accounts grew substantially during the height of her breeding program. The bank's president, Thomas Haywood, was well aware of the unusual profitability of Rosewood, but chose to focus on the financial benefits rather than their origins. Mrs. Whitmore demonstrates exceptional plantation management, he noted in a report to the bank's board of directors. Even within the enslaved community at Rosewood, silence was maintained through a combination of fear, manipulation, and survival necessity. Eleanor had created a hierarchy among the enslaved population that rewarded compliance and severely punished any form of resistance or disclosure. Those who participated in or benefited from Eleanor's program received better living conditions, superior food, and protection from the harshest forms of plantation labor. This created a class system within the enslaved population that made unified resistance difficult. Some enslaved people saw cooperation with Eleanor's program as their best hope for survival and advancement. Others maintained silence out of simple fear. Eleanor's reputation for swift and severe punishment was well established. Enslaved people who showed signs of rebellion or disclosed information about plantation activities were quickly sold to distant plantations or subjected to harsh physical punishment. The message was clear. Silence was not just expected, but enforced. The broader community's complicity extended to neighboring plantations, where owners observed Eleanor's methods with interest rather than alarm. Some attempted to implement similar programs on their own properties, viewing Eleanor's approach as an innovation in plantation management rather than a moral abomination. Letters between plantation owners from this period reveal discussions of Eleanor's improvements to plantation efficiency. Rather than questioning the human cost of her methods, they focused on the practical benefits and potential applications to their own operations. Eleanor's systematic exploitation was being normalized and replicated throughout the region. The network of silence that protected Eleanor's program was remarkably comprehensive, involving medical professionals, religious leaders, legal authorities, social elites, and economic partners. Each group had their own reasons for maintaining silence, but the cumulative effect was a conspiracy that would keep Eleanor's crimes hidden for nearly 2 centuries. This web of complicity reveals how deeply embedded systems of exploitation can become when they serve the interests of those in power. Eleanor's breeding program succeeded not just because of her individual cruelty, but because it operated within a society willing to sacrifice human dignity for economic benefit and social stability. Beneath the surface of Eleanor's carefully controlled system, resistance flickered like embers waiting for wind. The enslaved community at Rosewood had developed networks of communication and subtle defiance that operated beyond Eleanor's surveillance, creating spaces where humanity could survive despite systematic dehumanization. The first organized act of resistance came in 1836, when a group of enslaved women began coordinating to protect their children from Eleanor's evaluations. Led by Celia, Thomas's forced wife, they developed coded signals and hidden meeting places where they could share information and plan small acts of sabotage. Celia had evolved from a frightened 19-year-old into a determined protector of her community. Her position as the wife of Eleanor's eldest son gave her certain privileges and access to information that other enslaved people lacked. She used these advantages to build a network of resistance that operated through seemingly innocent daily interactions. The women's network communicated through work songs, with verses that carried hidden meanings about Eleanor's plans and movements. A song about planting rice might actually convey information about which children were scheduled for evaluation, while a hymn sung during evening prayers could warn of impending punishments or separations. Sarah, James's forced wife, became the group's intelligence gatherer. Her work in the main house gave her access to Eleanor's correspondence and private conversations. She memorized important information and passed it along through a system of subtle gestures and coded conversations that appeared to be routine household communication. The network's most daring action came when Eleanor planned to sell 3 children who had failed her latest assessments. The women coordinated to hide the children in the swamp for several days, forcing Eleanor to postpone the sale while search parties looked for them. When the children finally returned, claiming to have been lost while playing, Eleanor suspected organized resistance but couldn't prove it. Eleanor's response to the suspected rebellion revealed both her paranoia and her dependence on maintaining control through fear. She increased surveillance, imposed stricter discipline, and began separating family members to prevent what she called conspiratorial gatherings. But her attempts to tighten control only strengthened the resolve of those working against her. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. This helps the story of the Rosewood resistance reach more people. The men in Eleanor's program faced different challenges in organizing resistance. Thomas, James, and William were simultaneously victims and enforcers of their mother's system, creating complex loyalties that made open rebellion nearly impossible. But they found ways to undermine Eleanor's control while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Thomas began secretly teaching his children to read and write, despite Eleanor's prohibition against education for those designated as field workers. He conducted these lessons during his evening visits, disguising them as routine inspections. His son Thomas Jr. became literate by age 8, though he carefully hid this ability from his grandmother. James took a different approach, using his access to plantation finances to document Eleanor's activities in ways that might someday serve as evidence of her crimes. He maintained a hidden record of purchases, sales, and births that contradicted Eleanor's official ledgers, creating a parallel archive that preserved the truth about Rosewood's operations. William, the youngest son, struggled most with his role in the system, but found ways to show kindness within the constraints Eleanor imposed. He secretly provided better food and medical care to enslaved families, using his mother's trust in him to circumvent some of her more cruel restrictions. The children born into Eleanor's system began developing their own forms of resistance as they grew older. They created secret games that mocked Eleanor's evaluations, developed private languages that adults couldn't understand, and formed bonds that transcended the artificial hierarchies she had created. Marcus, one of Thomas's sons, became a leader among the plantation children despite being only 12 years old. He organized what appeared to be innocent play activities that actually served as training for potential escape attempts. The children learned to move silently through the swamp, identify safe hiding places, and communicate without being detected. The resistance network also developed connections beyond Rosewood. Celia's sister lived on a neighboring plantation and served as a communication link with other enslaved communities. Information about Eleanor's program spread through these networks, creating regional awareness of what was happening at Rosewood and building support for resistance activities. These external connections proved crucial when the network needed to hide children or adults who were threatened with sale or punishment. A system of temporary refugees allowed people to disappear for days or weeks before returning, claiming to have been lost or temporarily injured. Eleanor suspected organized assistance but couldn't identify the specific networks involved. The psychological resistance was perhaps most important of all. Despite Eleanor's attempts to control every aspect of their lives, the enslaved community at Rosewood maintained their humanity through small acts of love, creativity, and mutual support. They told stories that preserved their history, sang songs that maintained their dignity, and created art from whatever materials they could find. Eleanor's breeding program had been designed to reduce human beings to livestock, but the resistance networks proved that humanity could not be systematically eliminated. Even under the most controlling conditions, people found ways to maintain their identity, protect their families, and work toward freedom. The whispered rebellion at Rosewood never produced a dramatic uprising or mass escape, but it accomplished something perhaps more important. It preserved the truth about what happened there and maintained the dignity of those who suffered under Eleanor's system. The networks they created would survive long after Eleanor's death, passing down stories and evidence that would eventually expose her crimes to the world. By 1840, Eleanor's control over Rosewood was no longer absolute. She maintained the appearance of total authority, but beneath the surface, her victims had created a parallel world where resistance, hope, and humanity survived despite her best efforts to destroy them. The first crack in Eleanor Whitmore's carefully constructed system appeared in the autumn of 1841, when her youngest son William suffered what family letters described as a nervous collapse. Years of psychological pressure, moral conflict, and forced participation in his mother's breeding program had finally taken their toll on the 29-year-old man. William's breakdown began with increasingly erratic behavior. He was found talking to himself in the plantation's chapel, asking forgiveness for sins he couldn't name. Household staff reported that he wandered the grounds at night, visiting the quarters where his forced wife Anna lived with their 3 children, apologizing repeatedly for circumstances he claimed he couldn't control. Eleanor's response to her son's crisis revealed the extent to which she had lost touch with human emotion in pursuit of her systematic goals. Rather than showing concern for William's mental state, she worried primarily about how his behavior might interfere with her breeding program. Her letters to Dr. Pierce focused on finding medical solutions that would restore William's compliance, rather than addressing the underlying trauma causing his distress. The situation deteriorated when William began speaking openly about his mother's program to visitors at Rosewood. During a dinner party in November 1841, he shocked guests by referring to his children as products of my mother's experiments and asking whether they thought such arrangements were pleasing to God. Eleanor quickly intervened, claiming that William was suffering from fever-induced delirium, but the damage to her reputation had begun. Thomas, the eldest son, had been struggling with his own psychological burden for years, but William's collapse forced him to confront the reality of their situation. In December 1841, he made the first direct challenge to Eleanor's authority, refusing to participate in her plans to pair their oldest children in new breeding arrangements. "I will not perpetuate this system another generation," Thomas declared in a confrontation witnessed by household staff. "These children are human beings, not livestock to be bred according to your designs." Eleanor's response was swift and harsh. She threatened to disinherit Thomas entirely and have him removed from the plantation if he continued his defiance. But Thomas's rebellion had emboldened others in the Whitmore family. James, the middle son, began questioning aspects of the program he had previously accepted. His forced wife Sarah reported that he had asked her opinion about their children's futures, the first time in their 12-year arrangement that he had solicited her thoughts on any matter. The enslaved community at Rosewood sensed the growing instability in Eleanor's control and began to act more boldly. Celia, who had spent years building networks of resistance, started making concrete plans for escape. She had identified routes through the swamp, established connections with free black communities in Charleston, and begun preparing other families for the possibility of flight. Eleanor's attempts to reassert control only accelerated the system's collapse. She increased punishments, imposed stricter surveillance, and threatened to sell anyone who showed signs of rebellion. But these harsh measures backfired, creating more resentment and strengthening the resolve of those working against her. The economic foundation of Eleanor's program also began to weaken during this period. The systematic breeding had produced a large population of children who required care and resources, but were not yet old enough to contribute significantly to plantation productivity. The costs of maintaining her expanded population were beginning to outweigh the economic benefits. Regional economic pressures added to Eleanor's difficulties. The rice market had become increasingly unstable, and competing plantations using more conventional labor systems were achieving similar productivity at lower costs. Eleanor's breeding program, which she had justified partly on economic grounds, was no longer producing clear financial advantages. External scrutiny of Rosewood also intensified during this period. William's public statements had created gossip throughout Charleston society, and some community members began asking more pointed questions about the plantation's operations. Judge Crawford could no longer dismiss all inquiries as inappropriate speculation. Some influential families were demanding answers. The medical establishment also began to distance itself from Eleanor's program. Dr. Pierce, who had provided professional cover for her activities, faced criticism from colleagues who questioned his involvement in what they termed unconventional plantation practices. Professional pressure forced him to reduce his association with Rosewood, depriving Eleanor of important institutional support. Eleanor's response to these mounting pressures revealed the desperation behind her facade of control. She began destroying documents that might incriminate her, burning correspondence and modifying official records to obscure evidence of systematic breeding. But her meticulous record-keeping habits worked against her. She had created too much documentation to eliminate completely. The breaking point came in March 1842, when Anna, William's forced wife, attempted to escape with her 3 children. The escape attempt failed, but Anna's capture revealed the extent of the underground network that had been operating at Rosewood. Eleanor discovered that her enslaved population had been planning coordinated resistance for years. Eleanor's interrogation of the captured escapees exposed names, meeting places, and communication methods that shattered her illusion of total control. She realized that while she had been documenting her systematic breeding program, her victims had been documenting her crimes and building networks that could eventually expose her activities to the outside world. The psychological impact of these revelations on Eleanor was severe. The woman who had prided herself on scientific precision and systematic control discovered that she had been operating within an elaborate deception created by those she thought she owned. Her victims had been planning their resistance while appearing to submit to her authority. In April 1842, Eleanor made the decision that would ultimately preserve evidence of her crimes for future generations. Rather than continuing to destroy documents, she began securing them in locked containers, apparently hoping that future generations of her family would understand and validate her work. This decision to preserve rather than destroy would prove crucial when historians finally uncovered the truth about Rosewood nearly 2 centuries later. The unraveling of Eleanor's system accelerated through the spring and summer of 1842. Family loyalty collapsed, resistance networks operated more openly, and external pressure mounted. The breeding program that had defined Rosewood for over a decade was finally approaching its end, though the trauma it had created would echo through generations yet to come. The death of Eleanor Whitmore on September 15, 1842, should have marked the end of Rosewood's dark chapter, but instead it initiated a decades-long conspiracy to bury the truth about her breeding program. The family's desperate attempts to preserve their reputation would create layers of deception and document destruction that would keep Eleanor's crimes hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Eleanor's final months had been marked by increasing paranoia and isolation. As her control over the plantation collapsed, she retreated into her private study, obsessively reorganizing her records and writing what she called her vindication, a lengthy manuscript defending her breeding program as scientific progress rather than systematic exploitation. Thomas Whitmore discovered this manuscript among his mother's papers immediately after her death. The document, written in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, provided a comprehensive confession of everything she had done at Rosewood. It detailed her selection methods, breeding schedules, child evaluations, and long-term genetic goals, with the same clinical precision she had applied to her ledgers. The manuscript presented Thomas with an impossible choice. Publishing or preserving his mother's confession would expose the full extent of her crimes, but it would also destroy his family's reputation and potentially subject them to legal consequences. The document was evidence of systematic crimes that had no statute of limitations in the moral court of public opinion. After consulting with James and the still mentally fragile William, Thomas made the decision that would shape the Whitmore family legacy for generations. They would destroy all evidence of Eleanor's program and create an alternative narrative that portrayed her as a benevolent plantation mistress who had treated her enslaved people with unusual kindness. The cover-up began immediately. Thomas supervised the burning of Eleanor's ledgers, correspondence, and confession manuscript in the fireplace of her study. The brothers worked through the night, feeding years of meticulous documentation into the flames. But their efforts to eliminate evidence were incomplete. Eleanor had been too thorough in her record-keeping, and copies of some documents had been stored in locations they didn't know about. The enslaved community at Rosewood faced a different kind of crisis after Eleanor's death. Those who had been part of her breeding program were suddenly free from her systematic control, but they remained enslaved and vulnerable to being sold or relocated. The brothers had to decide what to do with the evidence of their mother's crimes that lived and breathed in the form of dozens of mixed-race children. Thomas's solution was to maintain the existing arrangements while obscuring their origins. The forced marriages would continue as normal relationships, the children would remain at Rosewood as valuable property, and the systematic breeding would end while appearing to evolve naturally. This approach preserved the family's labor force while eliminating the most obviously criminal aspects of Eleanor's program. But the psychological trauma of Eleanor's system couldn't be hidden as easily as documents. William never recovered from his involvement in the breeding program, spending his remaining years in what family letters euphemistically called retirement due to poor health. He died in 1847, apparently by suicide, though official records listed the cause as accidental drowning. James assumed control of Rosewood's operations and worked to transform the plantation into something resembling a conventional slavery-based operation. But the population structure Eleanor had created, dozens of mixed-race children bearing obvious family resemblances to their white relatives, made this transformation impossible to complete convincingly. The regional community became complicit in the cover-up through their own need to maintain social stability. Those who had knowingly supported or ignored Eleanor's program had their own reasons for preferring silence. Judge Crawford, Dr. Pierce, Reverend Manning, and others who had provided institutional cover for Eleanor's activities worked to bury evidence of their own complicity. Official records from this period show systematic alterations and omissions designed to obscure the true nature of Eleanor's program. Birth records were modified to obscure parentage, death certificates were altered to hide suspicious circumstances, and court documents related to plantation operations were removed from accessible files. The Charleston social elite participated in the cover-up by simply forgetting what they had witnessed at Rosewood. Conversations about Eleanor's unusual plantation management methods disappeared from correspondence and social gatherings. The woman who had once been known for her innovative approaches to enslaved population management became remembered as a conventional plantation mistress who had died tragically young. The enslaved community at Rosewood faced enormous pressure to maintain silence about their experiences under Eleanor's program. Those who had been direct victims of the breeding system were warned that speaking about their past would result in immediate sale and separation from their families. The threat was credible. Thomas and James had the legal authority to destroy the lives of anyone who challenged their narrative. But silence came at an enormous psychological cost. Celia, Sarah, Anna, and the other women who had been forced into Eleanor's breeding program carried trauma that they could never fully express or process. Their children grew up knowing they were different from typical enslaved people, but forbidden from understanding why or discussing their unique circumstances. The cover-up extended to the broader historical record. Local historians writing about the region's plantation economy received sanitized information about Rosewood that portrayed Eleanor as a progressive plantation mistress who had improved the lives of her enslaved people through enlightened management practices. By 1850, the official story of Eleanor Whitmore had been established. She was a devoted Christian woman who had managed her plantation with unusual care for the welfare of her enslaved people, creating a model of benevolent paternalism that other plantation owners admired and attempted to emulate. Her early death had been a tragic loss for both her family and the broader community. This fabricated legacy was maintained through careful curation of surviving documents, selective preservation of favorable correspondence, and the systematic destruction of anything that contradicted the official narrative. The Whitmore family became guardians of a lie that they believed was necessary to preserve their social position and protect their descendants from the consequences of Eleanor's crimes. The price of this silence was measured not just in destroyed documents and altered records, but in the continued suffering of those who had lived through Eleanor's program. They were forced to carry their trauma in isolation, unable to seek justice or even acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The enslaved people at Rosewood understood that their survival depended on maintaining the fiction that Eleanor had been a kind mistress who had treated them well. They had to deny their own experiences and protect their children by teaching them to never speak about what they had witnessed or endured. This conspiracy of silence would prove remarkably durable, surviving the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the transformation of American society through the 20th century. The truth about Eleanor Whitmore's breeding program would remain buried for 181 years, protected by layers of deception, document destruction, and collective amnesia that served the interests of those in power while denying justice to her victims. The demolition of the old Charleston County Courthouse in February 2023 was supposed to be routine urban renewal, clearing space for a modern judicial complex that would serve the community's growing needs. Instead, it became the moment when Eleanor Whitmore's carefully buried crimes finally saw daylight after 181 years of silence. Construction supervisor Maria Santos was overseeing the basement clearance when her crew discovered a water-damaged but intact trunk hidden behind a false wall that had apparently been constructed during the courthouse's 1920s renovation. The trunk contained documents that courthouse officials had attempted to preserve during earlier renovations, not knowing that they were safeguarding evidence of systematic human rights violations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the genealogist who first examined Eleanor's ledger, immediately recognized that she was looking at more than historical curiosities. The documents included Eleanor's original breeding ledger, copies of her correspondence, and most remarkably, her complete confession manuscript, The Vindication, that Thomas Whitmore thought he had destroyed in 1842. "I knew within minutes that I was holding evidence of crimes," Dr. Mitchell later testified to the Charleston Heritage Commission. These weren't just plantation records. They were documentation of systematic sexual exploitation and human breeding conducted with scientific precision. The level of detail was both incredible and horrifying. The confession manuscript, written in Eleanor's own hand, provided comprehensive details about every aspect of her breeding program. She had documented her selection criteria for enslaved women, her methods of coercing her son's participation, her evaluation systems for children, and her long-term plans for genetic improvement. The document read like a scientific paper describing livestock breeding, except the subjects were human beings. Carbon dating and handwriting analysis confirmed the document's authenticity. Historical researchers cross-referenced Eleanor's records with other surviving documents from the period, finding corroborating evidence in church records, property transactions, and even architectural details of buildings at Rosewood that matched Eleanor's descriptions. The discovery prompted the formation of a special historical commission to investigate the full extent of Eleanor's program and its long-term consequences. Researchers began tracking down descendants of both the enslaved victims and the Whitmore family, using genetic testing and genealogical research to map the human legacy of Eleanor's systematic exploitation. The investigation revealed that Eleanor's breeding program had been far more extensive than initially apparent. Her ledger documented forced relationships involving not just her 3 sons, but also male enslaved people who had been selected for their physical characteristics and required to father children with specific women according to Eleanor's genetic theories. DNA analysis of volunteers from families with connections to Rosewood confirmed the systematic nature of Eleanor's program. The genetic evidence showed clear patterns of controlled breeding designed to produce specific traits, validating Eleanor's own claims about her scientific approach to human reproduction. Jennifer Washington, a Charleston teacher who discovered she was descended from Celia and Thomas Whitmore, became one of the first victims' descendants to speak publicly about the findings. Learning about Eleanor's program explained family stories that never made sense before, she said. My great-great-grandmother always said our family was different, that we had secrets that couldn't be told. Now I understand what she meant. The modern Whitmore family, represented by attorney David Whitmore, a direct descendant of James Whitmore, issued a statement acknowledging their ancestors' crimes and expressing support for the historical investigation. Eleanor Whitmore's actions were horrific violations of human dignity, the statement read. Our family bears responsibility for generations of silence about these crimes, and we are committed to supporting efforts to honor the memory of her victims. The Charleston Heritage Commission organized public hearings where descendants could share family stories that had been passed down through oral tradition. These testimonies provided crucial details that Eleanor's clinical records had omitted: the human experience of systematic exploitation, the psychological trauma passed through generations, and the strategies families had used to survive and maintain their dignity. Archaeologists were granted permission to excavate areas of the former Rosewood plantation mentioned in Eleanor's documents. They discovered burial sites that contained remains of infants and children who had apparently died during Eleanor's program, providing physical evidence that corroborated the written records. The investigation also uncovered evidence of the extensive cover-up that had hidden Eleanor's crimes for so long. Researchers found records showing systematic alteration of official documents, destruction of evidence, and coordination between multiple institutions to maintain silence about Rosewood's operations.